Now, immediately that we will start with our fourth session. The theme of this session is the building resilient cities. I will ask the dignitaries to take their seats. I request Fatak sir to take a seat as a chairperson. Uh, Today's session paper presenter, Dr. Soumik Lal is joining online. The first discussant, Professor Amir Bajaj, please take your seat. And second discussant, Dr. Gurudas Nulkar. So, in a one line that I will give this the introduction of everyone. Uh, as we know, this the Fatak sir is one of the leading urban thinker in the country with rich practice and teaching experience. The this session's paper presenter, Dr. Soumik Lal, is a lead economist in the office of the chief economist of Equitable Growth, Finance, and Institution at the World Bank, and he's also head of its climate economic team. Welcome, sir. Uh, then Professor Amir Bajaj is a lead practice at IIHS. He holds a PhD in management from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. Welcome, sir. Uh, then we have Nulkar, sir. Uh, he's a teacher and researcher by professor. He is a PhD in a sustainable and industrial ecosystem. Welcome, sir. Now I hand over to Fatak, sir. Over to you, sir.
So I think I'm sitting in this chair in the same fashion that, that I know nothing about this subject. So I think I would probably only do the job of a timekeeper. Let me then invite Saumik to have his presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Fatak, for inviting me to give this talk. Unfortunately, at this time, I can't seem to share my screen. So if someone were to give me the rights to share the screen, I could put up my presentation. Can you hear me and see my screen? Thank you, colleagues, for inviting me to give this talk on resilient cities, a topic that I think is increasingly of great importance to urban development, not only in India, but worldwide. So, what I will do in the next 15 minutes or so is to give you a bit of a broader flavor on what it means in terms of building resilience to climate change. Because there's often a lot of confusion in this conversation that building resilience equals paying for sectorial adaptation policies, like paying for urban investments in infrastructure and structures that make our cities resilient. But in fact, the broader concept of resilience is a bit more than that, and I'll try to get into that. Second, I'll try to provide you with a framework through which we can consider building resilience, which includes a combination of private action, public action, and market insurance. And finally, I will give you some new evidence at the city level based on a new micro study we have done looking at 10,000 cities worldwide on different aspects of urban resilience. So let me put this broader context to you. So if you were following the conversations on climate change at COP27 in Egypt that was held last month, I think many of you may have been struck that the conversation has been focusing on adaptation in terms of loss and damages. The question the developing countries have posed is that we haven't really been main contributors to climate change. And in fact, it is the development of industrialized countries that has put up all the CO2 in the air. And we need to be provided funding so that we can protect our societies and economies from the damages you are creating. And this led to the first ever agreement on setting up a loss and damage fund, where countries like Germany have, said we need to provide transfer of resources and technology. So this whole conversation on loss and damages and this rather myopic discussion on who created climate change and who is bearing the brunt of climate change puts the whole adaptation question into a very small question about resilient investments, largely in agriculture and in urban infrastructure. But if we were to look more broadly, the concept of resilience is somewhat broader because two-thirds of resilience comes from economic development. And in fact, poverty reduction, that is both through growth, through investments in human capital, and investments in social protection, really allow societies and allow economies to build much more robust ways to kind of come back from the shocks, from whatever the punches Mother Nature is throwing out. So that economic development also will help emerging economies and developing economies in pursuing energy efficiency. And then climate action, which is much more about a targeted issues to do with addressing climate change, has to do not only about adaptation in terms of sectoral investments, but also the growth and development of insurance markets. And here, in terms of mitigation, there are also issues about cleaner energy. But then, one is, of course, how we think about resilience. The second thing is how do we think about climate change locally? Because in the popular conversation, climate change often is reduced to talking about the weather. That, we have more rainfall, we have more floods, we have more uh, cyclones. But the big issue about climate risk is a word called radical uncertainty, which is the fact that past events are not a great predictor of future events. What also this means is that we don't know very well how the future will unfold in terms of the magnitude of climate related weather events or the intensity of those. And what this creates in the minds of all our decision makers is ambiguity, which really hinders decision making. As an example, think about this cartoon picture, which I took from inspired by Harry Potter, where Harry, Hermione, and Ron they go to the Forbidden Forest, and they come to the fort, and two parts of the fort at this junction, they're hearing mysterious noises. But what they also know is that on the left part of the junction are these really bad giant spiders that may be absolutely dangerous for them. On the right, they don't know what exists. No good, no bad, but they don't know. But the ambiguity aversion is all about choosing the options with more certainty in the prediction, even if the option is likely to be worse. So they go where they know there's going to be a giant spider and they're going to fight it out. So the fact about ambiguity aversion, in fact, becomes really important in building resilience because the challenge all of us face is to turn this radical uncertainty of what we don't know what we don't know into anticipated and manageable risk. And that's why as societies and economies become better off, they have a better handle at building resilience. And in fact, this whole concept of radical uncertainty limits to a large extent what individuals can do for their own good and put brakes in economic development. For example, farmers facing climate risks may not send their daughters to school because they want to hold on to as many precautionary savings as they can. And in fact, because economic development reduces a lot of this radical uncertainty, which, whether it's individuals, communities, or cities, or countries, are much better prepared to cope with both risk and uncertainty. And here in the economics language, this sort of radical uncertainty worsens misallocation of resources. And the reason is, colleague, because we end up playing it too safe through precautionary savings. We underinvest in human capital, we underinvest in financial capital, and as well as it reduces individual demand for self protection and increases demand for insurance. And in fact, because of uncertainty, even insurance markets don't know how to price risk, and that's why price and market insurance goes up. So the way economists think about in terms of addressing uncertainty and risk is really to come up with the interrelationships between self-protection, between insurance, and public investment. And Gary Becker, who was a Nobel Prize winner in economics back in the 1970s, in fact, came up with the schematic that looks at the broader issues of risk management. So these combinations of what self-protection, what we can do for our own protection, what we can invest in ourselves versus what markets can invest in, insure against, and the role of public investment. And the question is to see what financial products and what public investments can help firms, farmers, and families move away from playing it too safe to investing in productivity enhancements and human capital accumulation. Now, resilience as a concept is also about bouncing back from multiple shocks and learning from past shocks. The reason here is that climate risks don't happen to a city, are not faced by a city in just one instance, right? The city gets hammered by climate risk. And in the last few years, the city is also getting hammered by COVID risk. And all these risks are basically compounding each other till a city economy or a society falls down, right? And the idea of resilience here is to bounce back. And I put this iconic picture in front of you because this is a fight between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman in a city called Kinshasa. And this was a fight in 1974. And at that time, Ali, before becoming the reigning heavyweight champion of the world, gets pounded many, many times by George Foreman. And he's kind of got his back on the ropes. But then he comes back with a combination of a left hook and a right hook, and he kind of takes Foreman down. And in terms of resilience, the idea for us as a schematic to imagine is that our cities are being hit again and again and again by climate risk, now by COVID risks, and by many other risks. And all these risks are multiplying in a city. So the question is not about just building dam, dike, better planning standards to protect our city, but to figure out a combination through which self-protection, market insurance, and public investment can work together to build resilience so we can, in fact, be more resilient to multiple and cascading shocks. So, in that context, let me, in my last 6 minutes, tell you about some new economic research we have been doing on the pace of urban climate change, resilience, and adaptation. This is joint work I've been doing with Professor Matthew Khan at the University of Southern California, Sahil Kandi and Vaidehi Tandel, who are colleagues of yours, and Rajat Kochar, who is a graduate student. And for the first time, we have been able to use data on floods for approximately 10,000 cities across the world, covering 175 countries, to examine the different impacts of floods on cities in high and low income countries. This is probably the most expansive empirical work done to date on floods and economic impact. And here, what we do is we combine data that are nightlights data for these cities from 2012 to 2018, the global data set of geocoded disasters. And what's really interesting is the field of urban research, and urban economic research has really blossomed since these nightlight data have become frequently and freely available, because these nightlight data are great proxy indicators of economic activity at very micro levels that can aggregate it to the city level. And these are much more reliable than the sort of disaggregation of state and national statistics to the city level that are often used in economic analyses at the city level in countries like India. So we provide some new insights on how pace of climate change adaptation has changed. And these place-based shocks, they range from extreme heat, drought, flooding, and these are going to become more frequent, as I said previously, and intense due to climate change. And here we combine data for a city, year, and a month. So we create this panel data set on local shocks and recovery dynamics with micro empirical research to look at that Pavilic framework that I mentioned before about the interaction between self-protection, public protection of place, self-insurance, and market insurance strategies of coping with risk. So here we ask four first order questions about climate resilience. So first question is whether people are getting out of harm's way, or in the face of multiple climate related flooding events, do people kind of remain where they are in cities that they were, or they move somewhere else? The second question that I think matters a lot for urban planners is whether flood protection infrastructure enhances resilience. The third question is whether cities in richer countries recover faster. And the fourth one is whether economic development really is bedrock for resilience and protect cities from harm. So let me quickly give you some empirical insights. So in terms of the first question of whether people are getting out of harm's way, in fact, that's about private self-protection. Our econometric work shows that in the richest countries, that is, countries defined as high incomes by the World Bank classification of countries, cities that have been hit repeatedly by natural hazards and disasters see lower growth of population in future periods. That means individuals, people, businesses, they kind of see climate risk as being material and important and make decisions in a national portfolio of city to kind of go from a high risk city to a low risk city. This only happens in high income cities. In low income cities, there seems to be no relationship between future population growth and the riskiness of the city to climate related shocks. This could be maybe because land markets are imperfect, move, they don't have access to financial markets, and those are things that need to be in further research. But what we also do is to look at the death toll from floods. And over time, what we've seen is that the number of people killed by specific natural hazard and disaster events have in fact reduced. But again, here we see a stark difference between cities in low income countries and high income countries. Again, what we find in the econometric evidence is that for cities in high income countries, the death toll per disaster has actually reduced over time, but in low income countries, it actually has increased over time. So this also fundamentally shows how the preparedness and resilience vary systematically across cities at different stages of economic development. And the third question, whether richer cities suffer less, we look at these night-light data that I mentioned to you, and we try to look at the impacts of flooding events and what it means in terms of economic shock. And quite surprising, what we find is that both in terms of that floods in general have a negative effect, but the effect is about the same in medium and high income cities. But in fact, when it comes to a high risk city, that means city at the extremes of getting hit by a natural disaster, that's when some of the impacts are the most prominent. And finally, on flood protection infrastructure, we provided for the first time data from about 4,000 cities located in China and India and Mexico and the US, where we pinpointed large dams and looked at cities that were within 100 kilometers downstream of the dam and saw protected by one. And what our empirical evidence tells us very clearly is that in terms of extreme events, economic activity, of course, drops in the face of a flooding event, but for cities that have dams, in fact, the impact of the flood is almost close to nothing. So the flood protection infrastructure works in protecting cities, at least China, India, Mexico, and the US. These data are very hard to collect, and what we are hoping to do in the next 6 to 8 months is to increase the coverage to at least 10 more other developing countries. So I'm going to end my talk with the following conclusions. First, I think the big point we need to think about is that resilience is much more than adaptation. It's fundamentally about economic growth. Second, climate uncertainty is likely to put the brake on growth as people and firms are underinvesting in the activities that are known. And we need to translate uncertainty into manageable risks. And in this context, self-protection, public investment, and insurance need to be seen as complementary in terms of building urban climate resilience. And fortunately now, at least at the city level, the focus is way too much on public investment and way too little on level insurance. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop now and turn it to the chair again.
Thank you, Soumik, for a very enlightening presentation on climate change and exploring the relationship between economic growth and the resilience. I now turn to Professor Bajaj for his comments.
Thank you, Soumik. It was lovely to listen to you, and also congratulations on this paper. In fact, I think Dr. Kelkar sent me this, and I was curious, and then I could make the connection. So nothing kind of contestable here. I'm just throwing some ideas here for all of us to pick these up. I am since 2006 I have been working on these issues, so there is, and that's precisely the moment when India as a country also started waking up to this. So technically around 2008, a little before that. So I'll basically try and give three perspectives here. And Soumik's provocation is actually very interesting, and that's what I am also building on at this moment. And there is also a parallel that I would like to demonstrate. I think this point on economic growth is a very important point. So people who work on infrastructure make this connection that look, if you're not making your infrastructure resilient and you're not able to deliver services through infrastructure, then it will have an impact on the poverty reduction agenda. It will also have an impact on growth because people will not be able to increase their incomes or kind of look at opportunities that they could explore through that infrastructure. So that logic is clear, and there's a financial case for this, there's an economic case. Professor Abhay Pete is here, he has been writing on these things. The question is that how should we approach this? And that is the question. And in this realm, I think the questions are very, very fundamental. If I start with this provocation that look, and if you look at the global average annual loss data due to disasters, basically you are compressing the economy in the range of 1 to 1.5%. Now this is not big money, and the money to kind of invest in resilient infrastructure, like you are investing in infrastructure, there are money flows happening, but you're not investing in resilient infrastructure. The top up is not so much. It's 3, 4, maximum 5%. It's still not happening. Why? And particularly in developing countries, global south, because we have not been able to fix our governance. We have not been able to ensure that if I put in money, the state assures through regulatory or legal mechanisms or pricing mechanisms in place that I am able to make decent money. So essentially, if we look at, and Soumik knows this, that there's a lot of money globally, but it's not flowing where the need is. And it is not flowing because we have not fixed the governance. And that is why I always come back to the first session, which Dr. Jha was talking about, that essentially it's a game of fixing some basic things. We have to fix some basic things. So I'll illustrate this with an example. I have been looking at this climate resilience and resilience question in many cities for many years. I have worked in many cities, collected data, and I'll explain what I'm trying to say through, without naming these cities, some examples. So the question before us was, and this question came from the policymakers, that we need to make our cities resilient without having any idea of what resilience meant. So you start having conversations, and when you start having conversations, you realize that it actually governance 101. Basically, finally, when I went to this northeastern city, very important city and politically also very sensitive, the question was that finally it got boiled down to two things, and that's what the reimagination of resilience comes back. The reimagination idea comes back and ties up with what Soumik was talking about. So Soumik talked about self-protection, and I am just expanding it and picking up some elements from his presentation and talking about the idea of social protection, which essentially means that you have to deliver uninterrupted welfare on the ground. It's as simple as that. Because you have to get food to people, you have to get healthcare to people, you have to ensure that they get education, and you have to work in such a way that people are not constrained to participate in the local economy or whatever economy they are participating. You have to just ensure that. And these are all very fundamental, basic questions that we have been fighting for. So we are picking up the idea of resilience from what it globally means and what it means in specific context of, say, for example, infrastructure. If we locate this in Indian cities, it essentially moves into the social realm, and we should be strongly talking about social resilience, which means who is at most risk. What are we doing to ensure that this person doesn't so we are experiencing shock, but we are also experiencing chronic stresses. And those chronic stresses are all structural. It's poverty, it's lack of access to food, lack of access to water. So both these, we shouldn't be confused about this. So one is like what Shomik was rightly pointing about. So there are these big shocks that come. And we have to definitely ensure that some amount of mechanism should be in place so that people don't go deep into poverty, so that they're just not able to bounce back. And second, what about this daily stress, daily chronic stress? That also has to come back to resilience debate. And the point is, and that's where the disconnect is. So in economics, and Shomik knows this, that and particularly why money doesn't flow into risky investments. Because the source of money has a short-term horizon, and infrastructure systems have a long gestation period. So you want returns very quickly. There is a misalignment in that, and that's why money doesn't flow. Money can flow if you can ensure that you are going to guarantee adequate returns. Now all of this comes back into this economic growth story which Shomik was pointing out. Because, and Dr. Pathak was also talking about in the morning, that we have this fixation on the supply side. We have to get out of this fixation on supply side and try and work from the demand side. Where is the demand for resilience coming? Where is the social demand for resilience coming? Where is the demand flowing into the political system? It is not. The biggest example is that we have so much evidence that ecological infrastructure and nature-based solutions help in development, help in resilience, help in mitigation, help in adaptation, but still it is not politically attractive. The answer doesn't come from purely economics, it comes from political economy. How can we make that shift? That shift has to come bottom up from the social side, from the demand side. We had this discussion in the earlier session also, that we have this fascination on the supply side. It will not work that. Now some operational last few points. I personally, so if we look at thinking about resilience, what are the 3 or 4 things that would help us enter into this? One is, of course, what Shomik was talking about, which is economic development. Now this is linked to the employment service story, which is not, the narrative is not built. Which means that if we build a narrative of resilience into, bring it back and connect back to service disruption, connect back to income growth, connect back to inequality reduction, connect back to, it might have some political traction, but it will definitely make us understand and realize that the supply has to be serviced by demand, and we have to build an ability for people to service the supply. It is happening through an economic system. We all know DISCOMs are continuously failing in India because people are not able to pay the economic cost. Now there is, of course, we have to protect people, we have to ensure that their rights are not infringed upon. So that's one thing. The second is that we have this SDG frame. We have these 16, 17 goals. Now this neatly ties back into some basic service provisioning questions like water, electricity, sanitation, healthcare, education. And there's political buy-in to this. So it's politically attractive as well because there's a top-end commitment to this. The third is this risk story. Risk is like, look, You have systems in place, there is shock, and you experience this shock, and there's a lot of setback that happens, and then bouncing back becomes difficult. I feel that it has not gained traction because we have now entered into an era where we are talking about systemic risk. So there is massive interdependency, and that's the characteristic of infrastructure system. But our governance frames in 101 governance are not aligned to address systemic risk. Our governance frame is aligned sectorally. So we have to enter sectorally and address this, understand what is the risk to the sector, measure the connections with economic development and growth. Look at the output side. Look at employment questions, inequality questions, and then from there respond to this. Finally, climate is this new big opportunity. People are talking about a lot about climate. And I think the latest evidence is very clear that we have, and this was also Dr. Jha was saying in the morning, that we have now moved beyond the era of incremental intervention. Now we are in the era of transformational intervention, which means that it is not about one well or one lake. We are now entered into an era of multiple lakes and multiple wells. And that cuts across multiple governance frames. We don't have a handle on that. So in the morning when we were looking at city governments, now we are talking about massive fluxes. Water is coming from God, who knows, 300 kilometers away. That is under different jurisdiction. Some fight with agriculture and drinking water is happening in that jurisdiction. So, and climate classically is a multi-level governance problem. It is not a very city-scale problem. So, we are actually caught in a very bad situation. And that's why my approach right now is, and that's what I'm working on, that I think we have to build locally, focus on local systems, build resilience bottom up, and look at what we can fix. Exactly what Soumik was talking about in terms of using this flooding. I'll stop.
Thank you. Let me now invite Dr. Nulkar.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much, Soumik, as well as Amir, for the excellent comments which have been made till now. I would now add the purpose of this essentially revolved around economic development as and social development and inequity, reducing the inequity to that. The third dimension which I wish to introduce at this point of time is the ecological resilience. Climate disasters are not restricted to a few hundred square kilometers. They are about a large landscape. They are about a region. And therefore, I propose to say here that there is nothing like an urban resilience. We have to create the resilience in an entire landscape. Because if you look at urban conglomerations, they are net borrowers of resources. Mumbai doesn't have its own water, it's borrowing water. Pune city doesn't have its own water. We are borrowing water from completely different watersheds which are far away from us, so on and so forth. And if we do not consider the resilience of those landscapes, then we are in a very myopic situation about what urban resilience means. So, for example, Pune lies to the east of the Western Ghats, and we are completely dependent on the rains which fall upon the Western Ghats, and Western Ghats gets about 6,000 millimeters of rainfall. So, if we are unable to improve the resilience and reduce the ecosystem degradation which is happening in the Western Ghats, then Pune as a city will never be resilient in terms of climate action. Right? Coming to the point of floods, which Soumik very nicely explained. So I was party to being an expert on a couple of flooding events, one in the Krishna Basin and another in the Konkan Basin. In the Konkan Basin, let me give you a case of Mahad. Mahad is a small town in Konkan which is about south of Mumbai, south of Alibag. And it's on the confluence of two rivers, the Gandhari and the Kard River. Now, for years together, Mahad has been flooding. You know, there have been a succession of floods right from 1923, 91, 87, 91, 2005, and the latest was 2019. And there have been a spate of efforts on reducing the flood resilience, flood vulnerability of Mahad as a city. But this time we went into a root cause analysis. And we started from the ridge. We started from the crest line of the Sahyadris, which is the northern Western Ghats. And we looked at what is happening there. So one of the major problems that we discovered is the number of landslides which have happened in the northern Western. This time we reckon there are almost 5,000 landslides which have taken place in the northern Western Ghats, which is absolutely phenomenal. If you add up all the landslides till today in the last few decades, they were not 5,000. So the amount of silt and mud which is deposited in the river channels is simply phenomenal. There is just no way that there has to be a flood in Mahad if this siltation is not controlled, the landscape. So then we looked at the root causes of the landslides, and then we were able to write down a lot of other root causes. Coming to the confluence, so flood mitigation, flood resilience does not stop at the ridge. You have to continue it till the confluence. The confluence may be another river, or the confluence may be to the sea. In the case of Mahad, the confluence is to the sea. And the number of sand deposition, juttas as they are called, which have happened this time, are again phenomenal. So that is creating the entire afflux, which will tell us that Mahad has to flood. There is no other way. And if we have to reduce the risks, the vulnerability of Mahad as a city, and what I'm saying for Mahad is actually for all the villages in Konkan and all the towns, then we have to take an ecological approach, landscape approach towards improving the resilience of that particular city. Look at the point of the new Mumbai-Goa expressway. It's a very funny situation. So when we were looking at the flooding which is happening, the flooding which is exacerbated in Mahad this year in 2020, one of the reasons which we clearly saw was the way the new Mumbai-Goa highway is being constructed. Mumbai-Goa highway is constructed parallel to the Western Ghats. And the entire new Mumbai-Goa highway is at an elevated level. It rises about 15 feet when it comes near towns and villages, and it goes down to about 10 feet when there is nothing in the landscape. This is tantamount, this is nothing other than creating a dam. Because the Western Ghats are getting 6,000 millimeters of rainfall, 3,000 millimeters are draining into the Bay of Bengal, and 3,000 millimeters are going to drain into the Arabian Sea. But they are stopped by this, and the amount of culverts and the underpasses which are created are based on historic rainfall readings. And climate is not about historic, it's about what is going to happen tomorrow. So none of these culverts and none of these things are going to matter in the climate changed era. And therefore, if we have to make towns like Mahad and Ratnagiri resilient to floods, then we have to go back and do something with what we have done to the Mumbai-Goa highway. We have to go back and do something at Mahabaleshwar, because the amount of deforestation which has happened is going to increase the chances of landslides. And therefore, my contention is that urban resilience is nothing but a sum of the resilience of the entire landscape. And when I'm saying the sum of the resilience of the entire landscape, it accounts for all the ecosystems, not just aquatic ecosystems, not just marine ecosystems, mountain ecosystems, forest ecosystems, the livelihoods of people who are depending upon all of these ecosystems. For example, in the Sahyadris, the Adivasis are depending severely on the forest as an ecosystem. But deforestation is not being driven by the Adivasis. Deforestation, you'll be surprised, is being driven by Mumbai, because 1,400 trucks of wood are taken to Mumbai for being burnt in bakeries. Right. So unless we make a policy for Mumbai as a city for bakeries, then we will not be able to solve the problem of deforestation. And when that is not solved, the problem of landslide is going to exacerbate. And when that is going to exacerbate, the vulnerability of the villages around in the Konkan are going to increase because of that. Right. Or look at forest fires. Now, forest fires in the Sahyadri are leading to tremendous deforestation. What is the reason for forest fires? Cities. The demand for milk, paneer, cheese has increased. Families are getting smaller and smaller. The ones who are living on the higher middle altitudes of Sahyadri, most of the families are turning old. Their children are working in Mumbai and Pune. And because they're working in Pune and Mumbai, they can no longer till the land. The easiest way out is to buy a couple of buffaloes or cows. And then there is a milk collection van which comes and collects van at your doorstep. Now, if this is happening, the demand for grass is going to increase logarithmically. And when the demand for grass increases, the deforestation has to occur because grass doesn't grow in shade. You have to cut down the forest, you have to have forest fires every season because then the grass sprout up better and so on and so forth. So then that is putting Kolhapur at a risk because of the easterly slopes of the Sahyadri are not being thought of in the resilience policy. So again, coming to the end of my arguments, that if you really want to have urban resilience, we must be looking at the entire regional landscape. And when I say regional landscape, that includes the natural capital of the region. Because the natural capital of the region is going to contribute towards the financial capital which is being generated in cities. Thank you.
We have had the base paper presentation and also two excellent responses to that. Could we open this now for discussion? No, I think it would be better to
So I'm going to restrict myself to mainly to what Shaumik talked about. Shaumik, there are is still there. Is there somebody? Shaumik, are you there? Yeah. So this is Abhay Pethe. I have thank you for a very clear kind of an ideas that you presented. The radical uncertainty, which you will agree is more like the Frank Knight's idea and Keynes's idea of probability. That's an aside. I have two questions. One, in your paper presentation, the first question that you talked about, have you controlled for the steady state of the developed countries in terms of growth vis-a-vis growing status of developing countries? Could that explain some part of what the result you're getting? The third question, I don't know why you said you were surprised, because if you have properly benchmarked what you're doing, I would have expected a similar result anyway. And the final point I want to make is the dichotomy between growth, which I like very much, and I don't like the dichotomy, but the emphasis on growth as a resilience resistor or helper. Could we think of a different framework of counting? If we did that, it would have an impact on procurement policies in terms of, and it would have, what I'm trying to say is that our regulatory practices somehow seem to have overtaken the computational kind of exercises we carry out, the calculus of investment and returns. So maybe a different kind of a framework might help resolve the dichotomy between infrastructure and growth and investment that you got about. Thank you.
Shaumik, you can respond to this comment from Mr. Pethe.
Okay, Mr. Pathak, what I could do is respond to those three and some of the other points. If that's okay. So Professor Pethe, I think on your first question, data that we have, you'll see in the econometric specifications that we sort of control for initial level of city income. So that's almost like convergence regression. So each country or each city is going towards steady state, and the deviation from that you can have. On the, I really couldn't follow the question you had on the second one, which was what was surprising, right? So if you could maybe explain that a little bit more. On the third and see, I think the big challenge right now in urban resilience in the economic sphere is whether we should invest in places or invest in. So if I were to take Amir's point, social resilience is really important. And investing in people and making sure we deal with day-to-day sort of shocks is as important as we try to deal with a 100 years, right? So much of the urban planners sort of focus is on building resilient infrastructure. It's not about dealing with social safety nets. And that's why, Professor Peter, we try in different extensive margins to set up what's the value of infrastructure? Does infrastructure matter and protect you on a 1 in 100 year plan? And the answer is probably yes. What is the cost benefit of that relative to other instruments we don't know? So I think the next thing one needs to do is to see, COVID's a great example. What if social protection systems are strengthened or counterfactual? What if they break down? How much more, and what is the kind of relative impact we're going to see with the social protection system in place relative to an infrastructure that's very kind of large scale? At the end of the day, I think in law fiscal calculus, can you think about every city having flood resilient infrastructure or climate resilient infrastructure? It should, right? Where do you allocate these physical investments? And I think that's the spirit in which we try to set up the economic analysis. Then on one last point on Dr. Milka's comment, that he really hit the nail on the head. That as India and other societies become mature, we need to think about a different growth accounting frame. It's not only about physical capital, it has to be about natural capital. Because there is no way we can have economic prosperity if we keep eroding the natural capital. Because if you look at all the high income countries, in fact, they have preserved the stocks of natural capital while converting physical capital into human capital, right? So, but we seem to kind of go down all dimensions and don't even improve human capital. So I think there's a need to rethink. So
If there are no comments, we will conclude. I have no intention of making any concluding comments. Uh,
So, one point, and just picking up from Professor Pete's provocation on this valuation framework and accounting framework, and also what rightly pointed by Shomil, I think when we finally build this, we need to answer this very fundamental question that from whose perspective we are building this. And I think last week we had a very interesting discussion in Bangalore, and Professor Amita Bhide was there, and we were discussing about public transport. And then she asked a very simple question: who is the public? And so we need to fix basic definitions. Only then we'll come into the accounting.
Sorry, I just had one question for you, Shamik. Have you controlled for the type of floods in these 9,400 cities? And was it what? Fluvial, coastal, or what? All three of them together?
we look at three different types of floods, but I think what's really important is you look at the frequency distribution of these floods. So if a city gets hit again and again and again by flood versus it gets hit once, it has a very different impact. I think that's where I really want us to get that given that we don't know what's going to happen and keep getting hit by these multiple events, is our city resilient? It's not infrastructure that will save us. strong social safety net, and natural capital networks. Right? So in a way, we will have to rebalance our thinking about helping professionals, right? These are the mighty and uncertainty questions that all of us need to think about, right? So,
Thank you, Soumik. I think a big thank for Soumik, Dr. Bajaj and Dr. Nulkar. And I would now conclude this session and take the credit for conserving the time for valedictorian.